The early morning sun filtered through the towering windows of the Washington, D.C. courthouse as Sarah Bennett adjusted her navy blazer and straightened her leather briefcase. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 2 decades of teaching constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center. Sarah hadn't planned to be in traffic court that Monday morning. Her research on racial disparities in the justice system usually kept her in libraries and behind computer screens, analyzing data and patterns. But something about this latest wave of complaints regarding discriminatory traffic stops had pulled her from the comfort of her office to these hard wooden benches. The courthouse hummed along with morning activity. Security guards nodded at a passing familiar face. Clerks shuffled papers, and nervous defendants huddled with their lawyers in a whisper. Sarah watched it all intently, her notebook open on her lap, her pen flying across the paper to capture the subtle interactions, how some smiled in greeting and others received curt nods, how certain defendants were cut short while others were allowed to speak at length. She wasn't just any observer, though few in the room knew it. As one of Georgetown's most respected professors, Sarah had shaped the minds of countless legal professionals, including judges who now presided in these very courts. Her articles on judicial bias were required reading in law schools across the country, and her expert testimony had influenced several landmark cases on racial discrimination. Today, however, she sat in the back, her bland outfit of a blazer and pencil skirt making her seem like any other working professional who happened to get ticketed. Her own citation in alleged parking violation on K Street was nestled in her briefcase. She had thought briefly about just paying the fine online, but something about the circumstances, the poorly posted signage, the officers brushing her off had turned her mind toward protesting it. The room slowly began filling with more people, young and old, professionally dressed and casual, representing the full spectrum of the varied population of Washington. Sarah noted how people naturally excluded others, creating invisible but unmistakable lines of division. Her trained eye caught the anxiety of the subways manifesting differently on faces. Some showed defiance, others resignation, and a few displayed the confident ease of those familiar with the system. At exactly 9 a.m., the BFF's voice rang out commanding everyone to rise. Sarah rose with the others, straight yet relaxed, as she watched Judge Michael Harrison enter the courtroom, his black robes billowing behind him. His reputation preceded him as being particularly strict when it came to traffic violations, especially regarding minority defendants. What the young judge could not know was that amongst those he would pass judgment on today sat the very professor who had not only taught him constitutional law, but had also written one of his recommendations for with the appointment of Judd Il. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she watched him stride confidently to the bench. She remembered that as a student, always the first to raise his hand, passionately idealistic about justice, yet at times blind to his own biases. As the proceedings got underway and case after case was called, Sarah continued to make very sharp observations about each interaction, every decision, each subtle shift in tone. She knew well that often the most dynamic lessons about justice came not from textbooks or lectures, but from real life. Force them to confront their prejudices. Little did anyone in that courtroom know, this ordinary Monday morning was about to become an extraordinary lesson in justice, humility, and the stubborn challenge of unconscious bias in the American legal system. Judge Michael Harrison sat in his chambers, reviewing the day's docket. At 35, he was one of the youngest judges appointed to the D.C. Traffic Court, and he took immense pride in maintaining strict order in his courtroom. The morning sunlight cast shadows across the polished mahogany of his desk as he sipped his black coffee. His clerk could stack the day's cases in neat piles. Parking violations, speeding tickets, and other infractions, which the majority of his colleagues deemed to be so trivial. But Harrison pursued each case for an opportunity it was to stand up for the law, however small the violation was. His reputation preceded him down the hallways of the courthouse. Defense attorneys warned their clients about his non-nonsense approach, and even veteran lawyers straightened their ties a little tighter before entering his courtroom. Some whispered he was trying to prove himself because of his youth. Others believed he was building a record for higher judicial appointments. Today's docket looked typical: 27 cases, most of them traffic violations. Harrison scanned them, making mental notes. His eyes lingered for just a moment on a parking citation on K Street, noticing the name of the defense, Sarah Bennett. Something about that name tickled at his memory, but he passed over it. After handling thousands of cases, names often seem vaguely familiar to him. He donned his black robes. Harrison thought of law school days at Georgetown, of those halls that had shaped and molded his sense of justice and the law. He remembered heated debates over constitutional rights, over fairness, over equality. But it was in traffic court that he had defined his own sense of justice swift and unyielding. A knock at his door warned him that it was time. Harrison stacked his papers neatly, squared his shoulders, and took a deep breath. In the mirror, he gave his reflection one last check. Young face set in serious lines, dark hair combed with military precision, robes immaculately settled. The picture of judicial authority he had toiled so relentlessly to maintain. As he strode through the private hallway to his courtroom, Harrison reminded himself of the personal code. Never lose control, never show bias, always adhere strictly to the law. These tenets had held him in good stead during his maiden year on the bench, admired, if not especially liked. For a fleeting instant, his mind strayed back to his constitutional law professor of old, who said something about justice and equality once seemed so clear now. In the daily grind of traffic court, justice seemed simpler. Black and white, guilty or not guilty, pay the fine or face the consequences. The bias stood ready at the courtroom door. Harrison could hear the familiar shuffle of people rising on the other side. In moments, he would assume his position of authority, ready to dispense justice as he saw fit, unaware that this ordinary Monday would challenge everything he thought he knew about fairness and judgment. All rise. The Bay's voice boomed, and Judge Harrison entered his domain, his expression stern and confident, completely unaware that among the faces turned toward him was one that would soon remind him of lessons he had summoned now forgotten along his path to the bench. The morning proceeded with Judge Harrison's usual efficiency until case number 47 was announced. Sarah Bennett, parking violation on K Street. The clerk called out, her voice echoing through the crowded courtroom. Sarah rose gracefully from her seat, her movements deliberate and dignified as she approached the podium. Several attorneys present noticed something different about her demeanor. She carried herself not with the typical nervousness of a defendant, but with the confident bearing of someone intimately familiar with courtroom proceedings. Judge Harrison barely glanced up from his papers. His voice, carrying the same stern tone, he used all Ming. Miss Bennett, you're charged with parking in a restricted zone during rush hour. How do you play it? Sarah's voice was clear and measured as she responded, not guilty, Your Honor. She began to explain about the obstructed signage and confusing rules of parking. But Harrison cut her off mid-sentence. Something had done quite a bit that morning to defendants. Miss Bennett. He interrupted, his tone rising, decidedly impatient. The officer's report clearly states you were parked in a clearly marked restricted zone between 4 o'clock and 6 p.m. Are you suggesting the officer was incorrect? Several observers in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably at his tone. A few regular attorneys exchanged glances, noting how the judge's interruption seemed particularly abrupt this time. Sarah, however, remained unruffled. Your Honor, if I may, she continued with practiced calm, I have photographs showing that the sign in question was partially covered by overgrown branches, making it impossible to read the restriction times from the angle of approach. Judge Harrison's expression hardened. Head heard every excuse in the book, and this no different apparently from Miss Bennett's point of view. The court is busy. The officer's report reflects no such obstruction as Sarah tried to reach for the photographs in her briefcase. Harrison was waving his hand dismissively. That won't be necessary. The burden of knowing and following parking regulations falls on the driver, not the city. The exchange continued with Sarah remaining poised while Judge Harrison became progressively stern. His responses shorter, his tone more clipped to the regular core of house to onlookers. It was just one more example of the young judge throwing his weight around. What was so remarkable about this exchange was the unusual calm with which Sarah received the obvious irritation of the judge. She stood tall and did not break eye contact, to each dismissal replying with the practiced patience of a woman who had spent years teaching others about the very principles of justice being demonstrated in this moment. As the exchange continued, the tension mounted, the air in the courtroom dense with unspoken emotion. even the bias shifting uncomfortably at his post. The other defendants waiting their turn watched with growing interest, sensing that something about this case was different from the routine traffic violations they witnessed all morning. Little did Judge Harrison know his next decision would morph this seemingly routine traffic case into a moment which would challenge his entire approach to justice. Leaning forward in his chair, Judge Harrison's decision was already set, even before Sarah could utter her final statement. The fluorescent lights cast unyielding shadows across his stern features as he began his verdict. Miss Bennett, this court finds you guilty of violating City Parking Code 23.4. He proclaimed, his voice ringing with the air of finality. Given your apparent disregard for clearly posted regulations and your attempts to dispute the officer's professional judgment, I'm setting the fine at $500, well above the standard $100 penalty. A collective murmur coursed through the courtroom. Even the regular court officers exchanged surprised glances. This was an unusually severe fine. For a simple parking ticket, a number of the other attorneys present squirmed. Understanding the sentence was disproportionate to the crime. Sarah didn't move a muscle, standing quite still at the podium. She watched as Judge Harrison's quick, jerky movements wrote out the fine on her citation. The young judge looked quite pleased with himself, quite certain he'd just made a statement on the respect due to the law. Moreover, Harrison continued, his tone even more serious. I'd like to indicate for the record that this court takes a dim to regard those citizens who attempt to wiggle out of their obligation by questioning the competence of our law enforcement officers. The court clerk tipped, furiously documenting every word. The regular attorneys present who frequented this courtroom had never seen such a steep fine for a parking violation. Some began to take notes as if this might become relevant in future cases. Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm and measured despite the circumstance. Your Honor, I accept the decision of the court. She paused, adjusting her glasses deliberately. However, I should point out that this will unfortunately require me to conclude my constitutional law lecture early this afternoon. Judge Harrison barely looked up from his paperwork, still writing his final notes on the case. Mississippi Bennett, your scheduling conflicts are not this court's concern. You should have considered your professional obligations before violating city parking ordinances. The courtroom was silent, unusually so. The tension could be cut with a knife. Even the bailiffs, we've seen hundreds of cases in this court, seemed to sense something big was about to. The morning sun had peeked outside and stretched through the courtroom in long rectangles, highlighting every dust particle that swam in the air. Sarah did not rush to gather her things. Each movement was intentional and calm. She did not seem angry or frustrated at the heavy penalty. On the contrary, there was something in the way she stood, calm, with a quieted confidence, implying this story was far from over. The next case was already being called, but several eyes still clung to Sarah. She made her way back to her seat. Judge Harrison had already moved on, oblivious to the fact that his next epiphany would shake the very foundations of his judicial confidence. Sarah's modulated voice echoed through the courtroom as she added one last comment. I do need to finish grading papers for tomorrow's advanced seminar at Georgetown Law. You remember those deadlines well, don't you, Judge Harrison, from when you were in my constitutional law class 10 years ago? The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Harrison's hand froze mid-submature, his face visibly pale. His head jerk was like a physical blow, filled with memories. Professor Bennett, standing at the front of the lecture hall, forcing students to deeply think about justice, fairness, and unconscious bias. Many of the attorneys in the gallery audibly gasped, the court clerk's fingers hovering, immobile over a keyboard. Even the bailiff, normally stoic, fought hard to keep his professional demeanor. Judge Harrison slowly looked up, really seeing Sarah Bennett for the first time that morning. She was standing there exactly as he had remembered her from his law school days. Commanding presence, inquiring look that had led him through most difficult constitutional precepts. It was ironic and devastating. Professor Bennett, who had written one of his strongest letters of recommendation for judicial appointment, who testified about his grasp of equal justice under law, had just experienced firsthand how far he had strayed from those principles. Memories flooded back. Her fervent lectures about judicial temperament, her warnings about the Sybil Ways bias could creep into decision-making. Her emphasis on treating every case with equal consideration regardless of the defendant's background. The face of the young judge turned red with embarrassment. Earlier, SMUD evaporated as he realized Head just provided a perfect case study, and exactly the kind of biased judgment she had taught him to guard against. Sarah remained standing, her expression neither triumphant nor accusatory. She was still the teacher, and this had become an unexpected lesson, not just but for her former student and for everyone else in the courtroom. That silence just hung there, and it hung there for an eternity. Those who regularly observed the proceedings of the court afterwards referred to that as the longest pause in traffic court they'd ever experienced. The morning sun continued its journey across the courtroom floor, illuminating the scene in the manner of a spotlight upon a stage where an extraordinary drama was unfolding. Judge Harrison looked down at the excessive fine he had just imposed and then back up again at his former professor. He was no longer the confident young judge, but once again the law student who had sat so eagerly in her classroom learning about the very principles he just failed to uphold. Judge Harrison's courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence. The weight of recognition pressed heavily on his shoulders as he stared at Professor Bennett, his former mentor, who had shaped his early understanding of justice. 10 minutes recess, he announced suddenly, his voice cracking. He banged the gavel. Not looking at anyone, he quickly retired to his chambers, his black robes billowing behind him. Once inside, Harrison collapsed into his leather chair, loosening his collar. His hands were shaking as he pulled out an old Georgetown Law yearbook from his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year, standing proudly with the Constitutional Law faculty. Memories flooded back. Her impassioned lectures about equal justice, her encouraging explanations during office hours, and most painfully, her glowing letter of recommendation that had helped launch his judicial career. The very letter sat framed on his wall, its words now seemingly to mock him. In chambers, Harrison replayed the morning proceedings in his mind. He had interrupted her sooner than the other defendants. He had dismissed her evidence without consideration. He had levied a fine 5 times the norm, and he had done it all without ever once truly looking at her face. The baya knocked softly, signaling the recess was near its end. Harrison stood before his mirror, seeing himself through new eyes. The young judge who had prided himself on being firm but fair now appeared to be precisely what he was, a man who had clearly lost sight of the basic principles his professor had labored to instill. Outside his chambers, the courtroom hummed with hushed conversations. Lawyers who regularly appeared before him exchanged knowing glances, each pondering privately how this revelation would alter the young judge they had come to know. Sarah stayed seated, grading papers, as if this was just another day in her decades-long career of teaching justice. Future lawyers. Her composure made the moment even more memorable. She hadn't come for an argument, but instead had allowed the moment to become a teachable one. Harrison took a few deep breaths, squared his robes, and steeled himself to return to the courtroom. He knew that the next few minutes would define not just this case, but perhaps his entire judicial career. Judge Harrison returned to his courtroom. His demeanor markedly changed. The confident stride was replaced with a more measured walk. His expression now more thoughtful rather than stern. Professor Bennett's voice began with an unexpected humility. "I owe you, and this court, an apology. My conduct this morning failed to meet the very standards of justice you taught me a decade ago." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I've allowed my position to blind me to my own biases today. You've given all of us, a powerful reminder about the importance of fair and equal treatment under the law." The courtroom remained still as Harrison picked up Professor Bennett's citation in vacating the $500 fine. "Further, I am dismissing this case in its entirety based on the unclear signage you brought to the attention of the court." Sarah nodded graciously. "But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Professor Bennett, your lessons about constitutional rights and equal justice weren't mere classroom theory. They were principles I swore to uphold. Today, I failed to live up to those principles." He turned to address the entire courtroom. "Let this be a lesson for all of us, myself especially, that justice must be blind to prejudice, then not to reason. Our duty is to hear each case with fresh ears and to see each person before us with clear eyes." The regular attorneys exchanged impressed glances. This was unheard of. A judge, out loud, admitting his prejudice and then correcting his mistake. Several started scribbling notes, recognizing they were observing one of those moments that would be etched in the history of the court. Sarah spoke finally, her tone unchanged from the hundreds of lectures she had given. "Thank you, Judge Harrison. This moment shows why our legal system depends not just on rules, but on the humility and wisdom of those who interpret them." The transformation in the courtroom was palpable. What had started as a routine traffic court session had become a profound lesson in justice, humility, and the ongoing struggle against unconscious bias. The remaining defendants and attorneys watched as Harrison continued the day's proceedings with a noticeably different approach, more patient, more attentive, more balanced in his considerations. 3 months after the courtroom incident, Georgetown Law, the central auditorium of the school, was completely packed. Presiding Judge Michael Harrison was standing at the podium, alongside Professor Sarah Bennett, addressing a very attentive audience of law students and faculty. What happened that day in traffic court, Harrison explained, wasn't just about a parking ticket. It was about how easily our biases can cloud our judgment, even when we think we're being fair. The case had turned into a powerful teaching tool at Georgetown Law. Professor Bennett had integrated the case into her curriculum and made use of it to how unconscious bias could seep into even the tiniest of cases. The story went national. Beyond Georgetown was quoted in law reviews and judicial workshops from coast to coast. Typical lawyers would comment on the noticeable change in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Every case was given due diligence. It did not matter how the defendant looked or where he came from. His reputation changed from toughest judge to being considered one of the most open-minded on the bench. Professor Bennett had turned the exchange into a seminal research paper entitled Justice in the Mirror, looking at judicial prejudice in minor courts. The paper was already shaping judicial training programs around the country. Sometimes Professor Bennett spoke directly to the group. The most relevant teachings about justice are born from lives' unexpected moments. What is important is not the fact that we all err, but how we act upon the revelation of our biases. The event generated a wider discussion within the system of D.C. courts. Other judges started reviewing their own decision-making patterns that produced new guidelines for dealing with the traffic court cases. Statistical analysis across demographic groups reflected a significant decrease in disparate sentencing. As the lecture concluded, one of the students asked Judge Harrison what he learned most from the experience. After a thoughtful pause, he smiled and said, "Justice isn't about knowing the law. It is about remaining humble enough to know our own prejudices and brave enough to correct them." The case became known as the professor's lesson. This is a reminder among law students that true justice requires constant self-examination and the courage to admit when we have failed to live up to our high ideals. The courtroom was in stunned silence as Judge Harrison stared at the figure before him. Professor Bennett, his old mentor who had instilled in him his earliest notions of justice. His hands gripped the wood, and his knuckles turned white. 10-minute recess, he announced abruptly, as the gavel cracked through the silent chamber. Not meeting anyone's eyes, he quickly retired into his chamber, his black robes billowing after him. Billowing behind him like a storm cloud. Once inside, Harrison slumped into his leather chair. His hands shaking, he pulled out an old Georgetown Law yearbook from his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year. Her eyes, both kind, yet challenging, penetrated through time back to his own. Memories surged back like a burst dam. The passion in her lectures on equal justice under law. Her patience during office hours when he struggled with complex constitutional concepts, and most painfully, her glowing letter of recommendation that had helped launch his judicial career. The very letter said, framed on his wall, its words now seeming to mock his recent actions in the quiet of his chambers. Harrison replayed the morning's proceedings with growing horror. He had interrupted her more quickly than other defendants. He had dismissed her evidence without consideration. He had imposed a fine 5 times the standard amount. And he had done it all without once truly looking at her face. The shame burned in his pectoral as he remembered how many times she had warned their class about the subway's prejudice could enter into decisions. Now he had become a perfect case study in everything she had taught them to guard against. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, whispers raced through the gallery. Attorneys who regularly appeared before Harrison exchanged knowing looks with others. The court officers tried to maintain their professional composure, but even they couldn't help glancing at Professor Bennett with newfound respect. Sarah didn't flinch, grading papers, as if this was just another teachable moment in her decades-long career. Her calmness made the situation even more poignant. She hadn't come to stir up a fight, but instead had let the moment be one of those great lessons in justice and humility. The bay knocked SL on Harrison's chamber door, showing the recess was all but over. The young judge stood in front of his mirror, but saw himself through new eyes. The stern disciplinarian who had always prided himself on being firm, but fair now looked like he had been a man who lost sight of basic principles that his professor worked so hard to instill as he prepared for a return to the courtroom. Harrison knew the next few minutes would define not just this case, but possibly his entire judicial career. The weight of the moment weighed heavy on his shoulders as he squared his robes and gathered the courage to face the truth about himself and his actions. He thought of what Professor Bennett would expect from him now. Not excuses, not defensiveness, but with honest reflection and course correction. The lessons she had taught in years ago were about to face their greatest test not in a classroom discussion, but in real-world application. The next knock at his chamber door was a bit more insistent. The recess was ending, and decisions had to be made. Judge Harrison took one final, deep breath in, squaring his shoulders. It was time for him to prove whether he could live up to those principles instilled by Professor Bennett into him all those years ago.